All right, this video is going to be on the Smith Loveless lift stations. We got some rags in the impellers. This is an EV model series station, but it's pretty much the same procedure for all of them. And one of our pumps is good. I'm going to shut it off. And this is our pump that's ragged up. I'm going to let it prime. And once it primes, you'll be able to hear the vibration, and that's a telltale sign that the pump is ragged up. The other way you can tell is, see that? And there's barely any water moving. What'll eventually happen is it'll trip either at your contactor or your breaker. I'm gonna turn that back off because it's also running dry and that's not good. But it'll either be, I'm going to start that other pump so it continues to empty our lift station. On our particular station, for this instance, that breaker was actually tripped. So on the control panel, it was showing as pump 2 running, but nothing was happening, and intermittently, the vacuum pump was trying to pull vacuum. Even though it was showing it running on here, I guess the level went down to where it needed to be. What may also happen as well with this is your controller contactor, whatever you want to call it, this will need to be reset. You could hit the blue reset button. I'm not going to stick my hands in there because everything is live right now. And it may start to run and you'll get that same vibration. So I'm going to go over the relatively simple procedure on how to pull the pump out. Quick thing I wanted to add too that I didn't say in this part of the video. You'll see towards the end I found that there was a wire that vibrated loose on there's a little sensor switch that's on the check valves on the discharge side of the pumps. If that is not working properly or a wire came loose or something along those lines, it will have the problem like I was talking about where on the screen it may show it running and it causes it to trip the other breakers. If that sensor is working properly and the motor does start, but it senses no flow like I showed with the check valve down, what will happen is it will show pump fault. How long it needs to run like that is dependent on what you have in your settings, if that's available in the screen. But I just wanted to add that in there too, even though that didn't happen on our particular situation, showing that it was just tripped on the control screen because of that. It will show that fault sometimes, possibly, if that's what your problem was. All right, so the tools, you don't need a whole lot of tools for doing this. We made a little modification. This is your top piece and then the bottom piece that come with these lift stations that are stored in each one of the holes. We had our welding shop add on another couple feet because what we found is we're using an electric hoist. We didn't have enough space to be able to, after we put the chains on, to be able to lift the pump up enough so it was a little better level for working on it. So we had that added. But some sort of chain hoist, whether it's a hand chain fall or an electric one like we have here, we found it easier as well to hang it with a chain because with a hook it was kind of cockeyed. I don't have it on there yet, but a chain to run across here for the hook to grab onto. Phillips screwdriver for removing the connections both here at the vacuum solenoid and also with the little sonar. A 15/16 socket. We use a DeWalt Impact, which makes it a little bit easier. If your gasket ends up being bad, you're going to want a new gasket for the bottom of this. It will operate without it, but it helps hold your vacuum better with it. And one trick that we found from keeping it from sticking to either the bottom or the top and ripping when you take it off is we just got some grease and we'll wipe grease on both surfaces to keep the gasket. That also helps it seal a little bit better. You can actually see where we had this one stripped out bolt hole, there's some grease poking up in there. Obviously some gloves. Then we use these paint strainer bags for throwing our rags in. You don't want to take the rags and just throw them in the wet well. I've seen collection systems operators do that, and I don't know why you would, because you're just going to suck those same rags up into the pump. We have a little pry bar that we use for pushing the rags out of the impeller. Once we get it open and stuff, you'll see what I'm talking about. Also, channel locks are good too for when they're really jammed in there, being able to pull on the rags and get them out. I'm going to set the camera up and show us doing all the work for pulling the pump, and I'll have it kind of go and like fast forward, and then I'll pause it with any comments while we're doing the work. All right, so we disconnected the two controls. We undid all the 5/16 bolts at the bottom. It's normal if it's holding vacuum for you to hear possibly a little bit of suction because it's losing its prime. Also, just so they're out of the way, I disconnect the vacuum hose. And then on our particular station, you can't see it where the camera is right now, but you have your power lead running up into the back of the pump. You want to make sure that that doesn't get caught on the pump flange or the 90 that's back there as you're lifting it up. And then as we lift it with the chain hoist, you're definitely going to hear the vacuum let go. Yeah, I don't know if you'll be able to hear it in the actual video recording itself, but and we've also already shut off our power to both pumps at the breaker. Since we're right here, we're not locking them out, we just have the panel closed, but we didn't shut off the main breaker because when you shut off the main breaker, at the bottom of the panel there's a 110 volt plug. That's what we use to power this. That loses power completely, and that's our nearest plug. All right, go ahead and lift it. You want to make sure this is lined up as best as you can. I'll bring it back down a little bit. Be in the center of the chain. Go back up. You can hear the vacuum. Yeah, see, we probably should have had this all the way out on this side because you can see it's picking up. Yeah, you want to know, just lower it back down and we'll move it. All right, before we get our hands all nasty, you can see the rags. Sorry, it's a really overcast day, but our rags are being pulled up through the bottom there, and then they get stuck on each side of the impeller. You can see our gasket actually is no good here too. When you're pulling the rags out of here, I've made this mistake myself. You kind of see them right here and you want to pull them out. What we found is actually a lot better is your water is being pulled up from the suction pipe and going up the center where you see the rag stuck right there. You're going to want to use the pry bar and stuff to push from here while you pull at the same time and try to get it to come out the bottom, because you're fighting the pump and it's going to get stuck coming up this way. This is how much we pulled out. This actually wasn't that bad this time. Bunch of wipes and stuff like that. Wonderful flushable wipes. This is the gasket that went bad. Looks like maybe it finally split when we put it on, because we reused this gasket probably 6 or 7 times. Another thing I want to show before we close it up is here where your little chamber is for the vacuum and stuff. Whenever you open it up, it's actually not that bad this time, but you always want to check to see if there's any rags, because what I've found a lot of times, if it was ragged up for a while, they'll get up top a little bit. And if you've never removed this piece right here, this is like almost like a little fork. The rags will get wrapped around the fork, and this will work. But as the pump cycles on and off, little piece of it will break off, and they could get stuck up here in your solenoid, which then causes problems with priming and stuff like that, you may not hold a prime, or the solenoid may not open and it may not even get a prime, so your pump won't run. The other thing you can notice too is we got a little bit of water seeping back. That's a sign that your check valve probably has a little bit of rag in it. We have the largest vacuum pumps available in this one, so it sort of overcomes that leak for us, so it's good. We don't need to service that all the time. And then the one last thing I probably should have said at the beginning is when you are pushing your rags out of the bottom of the impeller and stuff, you always want to make sure you got a hand or make like a screen that you don't forget to take out, because you don't want to unlodge your rag to put it just down in the pipe, and then as soon as you turn your pump back on for it to suck it back up and reclog. Since our gasket was bagged, I'm going to stop this now and we're going to go over to our little supply area and see if we have an extra gasket. Alright, we didn't have a new gasket to put on, so we're going to assemble it without it. And then next time we open it up, hopefully we'll have some to put in. Like I was saying earlier, what we used to do, well, what we do is we got a tube of just cheapo grease or whatever. If you have the existing gasket on there, what we used to do is put the grease around the bottom so that the gasket would stick to the top piece. If you're putting a new gasket in, you want to use a scraper or a wire wheel or something, get it all nice and clean, and put a whole bunch of grease up top first, then the gasket, and then put more grease over it. And what that does is the grease sort of holds it in place, because if you're trying to get that thing to stay lined up while you're lowering the pump in, you always end up tapping the impeller and stuff on the pump a little bit, getting it into place, and it all just falls in, or it comes off centered, and then you end up breaking the gasket and stuff like that. So the grease is a really good trick. If I mean, we're using this with sewage, so regular grease doesn't matter. If you by chance are using these similar pumps for something that's like food grade, or you don't want to put anything petrol based into your water, just use food grade grease. It'd do the same thing. But we're going to start lowering this back into place. Just got to be cautious lowering it down. You don't go too quick and nick up the surface on either side too, because then you might end up with a pretty bad vacuum leak. Alright, and at this point, what we found is a lot easier. We had to reposition it so it dropped in a little bit more straight. Is get it so it's just like 1/8 of an inch above where it is. That way it gives you a little bit more play for when you're trying to put the bolts back in. Otherwise it's a pain in the ass, because you might get like half of them to line up, and then you need to lift it back up, or you're trying to wrestle with it to get it into place. So we'll usually just get most of the bolts started, you know, get them 3-4 turns in by hand, and then lower it into place and then tighten them up. And I honestly don't know what the recommended torque is on these bolts, if there is any, but they don't need to be that tight, especially if you have the gasket on there. I mean, what we would do generally is snug them, and then like any other fitting, go around it in an opposite fashion, and for like 3 or 4 seconds, when the impact starts to actually pound, do that and it's tight enough. In case your wires are short, the other thing you want to do too is make sure that this part of the pump is where you had it before. Like for example, if you move it too far over this way, your wires might not reach. We have a lot of extra wire in this one, so it really doesn't matter. We just put it here because that's the easiest for service. Same thing with your vacuum hose. All right, everything's reconnected. What I always do is leave all the chain fall and stuff ready in case there's something else wrong with it. Depending on how long your pump was jammed up like this and trying to run and vibrating, what we found happened to us quite a few times is these smaller bolts up here, they actually came pretty loose. So you want to double check to see that nothing else vibrated loose. We had this vibrate loose. Inside this wire connector here, we had, no, I'm sorry, it was the one down here for the sonar. We had a wire come loose on the inside of here from vibration. So it was causing the pump to never recognize when it was primed enough. You'll know that this has proper power. You can unplug it and plug it back in a few times because there's a green light, but if it's really bright, you hear the ringing of it too. It's like a really high-pitched ring. Same thing goes for the wires in the check valve sensor. This one they actually fell out of, and that's another thing I need to do. But this whole station vibrates like crazy when it gets really bad. So double check that. Pretty much anything you could think of to see if it has vibrated loose. I actually just noticed after finishing up and cleaning up here, I was talking about wires vibrating loose. I'm gonna do my best to show this. Oh, well, it just hit its off point, but my connector for the check valve sensor came out. And when I showed up, it showed that this was running, even though it wasn't running. What would have happened at that point is if it showed it was running and that this sensor was plugged in, it should have shown as a pump fault. But because it wasn't plugged in, like if the sensor goes bad, it won't stop the pump from running. That's how they set it up. So I'm gonna plug that wire back in. Like I said, check for stuff that vibrates off. All right, so we're gonna turn, I got my switches off up here. Put power onto both the pumps, and then I always double check and hit the reset button on the contactors as well. That means we're finished in that side of the panel. And on this side, sometimes what I would do too is shut the blowers off. I didn't need to do that this time. So now our level's down below where it should be calling, so I'm going to move them to auto. We know one is good, so on my panel, are you able to see the panel on the screen with it? Pump 2 is the one that's in lead right now. So what you can do is you can go into wet well level, and these screens are all a little bit different on some of them. Right here, this shows my set points. But what I want to do is a simulation to get the pump to turn on and see if it's going to work. Because when you move these switches to hand, that just starts the motor, that doesn't start the priming process. So you hold down on wet well level, you'll see it and go to simulation. And then what this does is it simulates the level instead of reading it. You want to move simulation on, and you'll see as I move it up, once I hit my on set point, pump 2 should start to prime. We'll see if it primes and make sure it pumps and doesn't vibrate. There it goes. So we'll let it prime. I'll take it now. And as we saw, that check valve had a little bit of a leak, and this is going to be a fresh prime on top of not having a gasket. So it's going to take a little while for this pump to prime up. All right, there we go. She finished priming, and as you can see now, very smooth. Check valve is up, and you can clearly hear this thing moving water. It's moving a ton of water. So I'm going to go back over to the screen, and since we know it's good, I just wanted it to start. I'm going to go simulation off. Well, I guess it was already, something happened here. I guess I clicked it off, but what it's going to do is go down to my set point for off now. Because I could have simulated the level back down to 0 and it would have shut off. But it's working. These Smith Loveless lift stations, I don't put any blame on the lift station itself for the reason why it plugged up like this. We actually have it happen at least once a month here. We have a bunch of people who put tons of solids in, like cleaning rags, underwear, t-shirts, tampons, you know, all the stuff you're not supposed to put in the system, and tried to get them to stop, but there's no stop. But at least it makes it easy to service. I mean, this video is going to end up being way longer than what it takes once you've done this a few times. First time we did it took us about an hour. Me and my partner, we can do this service of unplugging it within like 20 to 30 minutes from starting setting up, having it apart, gasket, clean it out, put it back together, have it running like it just did. If you found this video and you liked having something show about how to service on these Smith & Loveless stations, let me know, because we do quite a bit of work on these. Our system, we're getting more of them because it's nice. There's no confined space entry except during the initial setup for the most part. But if there's some particular service that you might want to see on here, let me know, and then when we run into that problem next time, I'll take a video somewhat like this talking through how to troubleshoot and stuff like that, and I'll post it up.